The protagonist of a novel or any piece of fiction does not have to be likable. They don't owe you that. This is something I've talked about in the past, and I will continue to do so with energy and verve. Because it's true. It consistently annoys me that people complain about unlikable protagonists. As authors have pointed out, a protagonist doesn't have to be likable or nice or good. They simply have to be interesting, compelling. Unlikable protagonists serve many great purposes. For one thing, reading fiction has been proven to increase our capacity for empathy. It literally makes you a better person to read good fiction regularly. And I think a decent helping of what we consume as readers or watchers of fiction should consist of unlikable protagonists, because that expands your moral compass. Disliking a protagonist and understanding why you dislike them is a good mental exercise. They can also simply be entertaining. There are so many awful protagonists that are fun to hate. They get under your skin and you enjoy rooting against them and wondering what awful things are going to happen to them. It's fun, it's healthy, it's good for you, it's varied, and it's interesting. So with that mini rant out of the way, let's talk about some books with fantastic, unlikable protagonists. I was inspired to make this video when I recently read Eliza Clark's Boy Parts, so we'll start here. Boy Parts is the debut novel by British author Eliza Clark, and it follows a protagonist called Irina. She's in her late 20s. She's a photographer, she's a university graduate, she works part-time at a pub, she lives in Newcastle up in the north, and she's a really unlikable, horrible person. Irina treats her friends terribly. She has little regard for the people around her. She hates her mother and rants and raves about her, and Irina thinks that she is above everyone else. Whatever is currently trendy, she's beyond that. She spends her free time watching art house and horror movies, and the real cincher is the fact that her photography is extreme. She meets men on the street, on the bus, wherever she is in public, and if those men have some kind of quality that she finds alluring, intriguing, even if they look very, very plain and uninteresting, she will invite them to her studio, which is also her home, and she will photograph them in erotic situations. Her photography gets her more and more attention, and fame and success within the photography world, but she treats people terribly in the process. The main guy that she meets in this story is a young man who is going to start training to be a teacher soon. He likes kids, he's a good guy, and she treats him awfully. She photographs him and he's crying, he's feeling really uncomfortable and shamed by what he's doing. He's not into this stuff and she doesn't care, she doesn't notice. Irina is awful. And all the while, you're reading this book and wondering why. Why is she like this? What is this compulsion? What is the driving force behind her as a character? She is addictive as a protagonist. You get deeper and deeper inside her mind, you go further and further into her past through her memories and flashbacks, and you grow to understand her better, while also feeling like you're walking in place and not really knowing the real her at all. It is so compelling. She's a horrible, awful person. But why? I kept asking that all the way through. Boy Parts is a really addictive thing. Another wonderful example of how to write unlikable protagonists so well is anything by Ottessa Moshfegh, but we'll talk about her most famous work here. My Year of Rest and Relaxation. This is a novel set in the year 2000 about a very rich young woman whose parents are dead and she inherited enough money from them to buy an apartment in the Upper East Side in Manhattan. And she is tired, she is exhausted by life. She has a therapist who is completely insane and treats her very badly. And she's decided that she's going to self-induce a coma out of various drugs and just sleep away an entire year. She wants to just fall away from life. And throughout the novel, you learn more about her relationship to her family and herself as a person. She went to Columbia, she used to have a really good job, but she didn't need it because of this inheritance. So she's a rich, entitled, lazy person. And laziness is a fascinating thing in our society because you can argue that laziness isn't real. If a person doesn't have the energy to do their job, if they might be described as a layabout, you can dig into that person and figure out why they are like that, why they feel uninspired, why they feel tired all the time. They might be neurodiverse, they might be depressed, they might have a disability. There are so many reasons why a person might be described as lazy, when laziness itself isn't really the cause, and this book kind of explores that in a really interesting and off-kilter kind of a way. I could talk about this book for ages. In fact, I did a review of it that was pretty long because this is a weirdly compelling book. Again, a lot of these novels are compelling. When you have an unlikable protagonist who's very obnoxious, who's very, very entitled, who's very, very self-involved, and you want to understand them and their nature better, it is compulsive, it is addictive. Like Boy Parts, this is a book that you will rip through as you try to understand the protagonist better, for all of her faults and all of her unlikability. Now let's go back in time and talk about Wuthering Heights, which I've just realised now I no longer own a copy of. Wuthering Heights is my second favourite classic novel, after another book on this list. And I no longer own a copy. That's wild. I need to go get one. But Wuthering Heights is famously disliked. Again, I've done a video on it. People don't enjoy Wuthering Heights, often because they go into it expecting a romance, expecting a beautiful love story, a tale of forbidden love. And that's not really what you get. There is love in the story, and it is a romantic novel, but in a more traditional sense. Not what we now think of as romance, but rather it is a gothic romantic tale of its period. And it's set in a small, isolated place, just 2 houses on the Yorkshire moors, where every single person who lives in that area, who lives in those 2 houses, at any given time, is an arsehole. Every single person. No matter their age, their gender, their background, they're all horrible people. They're horrible to each other, they are irredeemable, and our 2 main characters are Cathy and Heathcliff, the 2 lovers. Heathcliff was the adopted son of Cathy's family. Her father found him during a business trip. He was a street urchin in Liverpool, and he took him in and said, "Come on lad, I'll give you a home." And as he grows up in this house, he falls in love with Cathy. But Cathy is a self-entitled bitch. She is cruel to him, she is misguided, her principles are misplaced, and Heathcliff is massively bullied throughout his youth in this house. And this bullying twists him into a monstrous form. He is a gothic monster in a sense. But the aggressive love, the toxicity between these 2 and the other characters in the book is so Moorish. I love these terrible, awful people so much, and I think Wuthering Heights is kind of a litmus test for people who like or don't like, appreciate or don't appreciate unlikable characters, because you're not going to find a more condensed group of horrible people in a single piece of fiction than Wuthering Heights. And if you can enjoy Wuthering Heights for all of the awfulness, the toxicity, the fated brokenness of these people, if you can enjoy all of that, you get it. They are disdainful, but because this is a gothic story, it almost feels like they are fated to be so. Their environment, their homes, their actions, their relationships to each other, everything about them is doomed to be awful, and I love them for it. A recent and pretty extreme example of a book with a very unlikable protagonist, very much intentionally so, is Yellowface. I say intentionally because our unlikable protagonist serves a very specific moral and political function. Yellowface by R.F. Kuang is a masterpiece of a thriller, which explores a lot of different topical things. Plagiarism, the corruption of social media, cultural appropriation, and just out-and-out racism. Our protagonist is a white woman who has had very little success as an author, and she is best friends with an Asian American woman who is massively successful, a real gift to fiction. Early in the book, they're hanging out, they get drunk together, they're celebrating, and the Asian American author dies choking on a pancake. And now our protagonist, the white woman, has to decide, what is she going to do with this secret manuscript that her friend wrote that no one else knows about? She didn't kill her friend, but she took the opportunity at the moment of her friend's death to steal this manuscript. She knows it'll be a massive hit if it ever gets published. She knows she's the only person who knows about this. She was told about it in confidence. And now she has the opportunity to finish it, tweak it and edit it, make it sound like she wrote it, and get it published and become a sensation overnight. And that's exactly what she does. And you spend the novel hoping that she gets her comeuppance. But R.F. Kuang writes her so well that you start to feel like you want to root for her. And the guilt you feel when that feeling hits is so intense. Because you're in her mind, because you feel her stresses. Her paranoia sets into your bones. You worry about her. And then you have to catch yourself and remember, she's the villain, she's a monster, she's a bad person. She exists as an example of so many bad things in our society. Cultural appropriation, mishandling of social media, and plagiarism. And yet, because of Kuang's amazing writing, you start to root for her, and then you catch yourself and go, no, 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 don't do that, she's bad. Kuang is twisting our feelings as we read. It is amazing stuff. Then we go back in time again to Frankenstein, my favourite novel ever. Frankenstein is a work of gothic horror science fiction. It did a lot of things. It was the first book to do a lot of those things. And it's the greatest work of fiction in the history of all literature of all time, in my opinion. I am very obsessed with this novel, and our protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, is a monster. You might be familiar with that old joke that has kind of become memeified at this point. Knowledge is understanding that Frankenstein isn't the monster. Wisdom is understanding that Frankenstein is the monster. While that phrase kind of feels kitsch at this point, it's still true. And I think that phrase is kind of a good gateway into some good critical and analytical thinking when it comes to this book. Victor Frankenstein is our protagonist. He built a creature, which a lot of people refer to as a monster, and yet he is the true monster. But the creature himself is not wholly good either, and again, that's part of the morals and the lessons of this novel. The creature does bad things because it wasn't taught. It lacked a father figure because Frankenstein built it, got scared, and ran off, abandoning his child. Frankenstein is a coward, a corrupt, broken coward of a man. And the creature is a lost, frightened child who does bad and monstrous things, who turns to revenge and also becomes corrupted by it. There is so much going on here between these two characters. As a queer person, I massively relate to the vilification of the creature by society. A lot of queer people do. And what I also like is that the creature isn't wholly good. He is complex. And that makes him human, rather than being a creature. The fact that he's not wholly good or bad is human in and of itself. I could talk about Frankenstein literally forever. I sometimes think I need to just go get a master's and then a PhD in this book just to get it out of my system. But there are no good people in this book, especially our two protagonists. They're horrible, and they are living through a cycle of revenge and toxicity, and it's the best thing ever. People don't seem to talk enough about the unlikability of so many of Stephen King's characters, so I'm just gonna throw this one out there. Misery. Misery has an iconic villain, but go back and reread it if you've already read it. Our protagonist is not a likable guy either. I don't have much more to say about this one, I'm just throwing it into the middle here. No one talks about the unlikability of the protagonist of Misery. He is a chauvinistic, arrogant, entitled, smug asshole. No one talks about that. They just talk about the villain, but Misery. Good fun time. Another book I'm just now realizing I do not have a copy of anymore, no idea what happened to my copy, is The Pisces by Melissa Broder. Broder is another author who is famous for writing unlikable and complex female protagonists. Now I should mention that I do think that there is a strong element of sexism when it comes to unlikable characters, and the fact that people don't like them. And it's because so many great modern novels about unlikable protagonists are by women, about women. And society tells women to be good and kind and smile and be polite and ladylike and all of these things. It is sexist. And therefore it feels very sexist to begrudge a novel for having an unlikable female protagonist. That in and of itself is patriarchal behavior. And The Pisces also kind of feels like a test when it comes to this, because the protagonist of The Pisces is horrible. She is a truly nasty woman. She lives in Phoenix, Arizona, and her sister asks her to look after her flat on Venice Beach in Los Angeles while she's on vacation. That also involves looking after her dog. So our protagonist does just that. She has a few weeks to live in this flat in Venice. She meets men and hooks up with them, and she also happens to fall in love with a merman. There's a lot of sex in this book. A lot of it is really, really bad and awful and uncomfortable, and some of it is good. And it's all told from the female perspective. Again, that seemed to bother people who are gross. But throughout the course of this novel, she does so many reprehensible things. She's a depressed woman. Depression can make us into really bad people, as someone who struggles with depression from time to time. When we are depressed, we can be very difficult to be around. We can be toxic, we can be selfish, we can forget about and disregard other people's feelings. All of these are symptoms of depression. And so once again, I am looking for a reason to understand this unlikable woman, but as the novel goes on, especially in its third act, the things that she does are completely hateful. I'm not going to talk about them. I recommend reading the book if you haven't. The Pisces is very dark, very, very funny, and our protagonist might be the most unlikable woman I've ever read in a novel. A really fun example of how to write unlikable characters in a very modern and fun way within genre fiction is Alice Slater's Death of a Bookseller. I didn't expect this to be a book about unlikable characters when I first read it. I thought it was going to be a really fun thriller, and it is, but it's a thriller in a uniquely weird way, and our protagonists are very unlikable. This novel is set in a bookshop in the East End of London, and we follow two protagonists, two young women who are very different from each other. One of them is a kind of toxic femcel goth girl who becomes obsessed with the other one, who is a preppy, Cath Kidston wearing, tote bag slinging, obnoxious cottagecore girl. Neither of them are very nice, neither of them are very likable, and our cottagecore girl is going to die. She is the titular bookseller what dies. She's awful, and the fact that she's not long for this world didn't make me care at all. But our other protagonist is also horribly, horribly unlikable as well. She is, as I said, a gross toxic goth girl. These are dark and broken characters, but in very, very uniquely different ways. Alice Slater has managed to write very relatable women from very different walks of life, who have things in common while also being vastly different from each other, and makes them both horribly unlikable in unique ways. It really shows a broad understanding of how people think and function and interact on a daily basis, especially within a workplace. There's a lot of psychology going on here in these characters, and I hate to admit that Roach, the goth girl, is someone that I did find myself relating to in places. She reminded me of my teenage self a lot of the time. These are dark women with dark secrets who do dark things. It's all very unexpected, and it's all very cracked and broken. Another modern female author who is an absolute pro at writing bad, unlikable, broken, confused, vulnerable female characters is Sayaka Murata. And this is Convenience Store Woman, translated from the Japanese by Jini Taple Takemori. I really love the works of Sayaka Murata. This and Earthlings are wonderful, wonderful books. And our protagonist, Keiko, isn't necessarily unlikable, but there is nothing really likable about her either. However, if you're a neurodiverse person, if you're a person who struggles with how society operates and is structured, if you really vibe with the Kafkaesque, you're going to relate to Keiko. You're going to feel a lot for her. You're going to understand her. And I really think that she's one of those characters that is very well understood and related to by neurodiverse people, and less so by pretty much everyone else. I think that's fascinating. Neurodiversity is something that other people struggle with from the outside. Keiko is such a wonderful example of that. At no point in the novel is it explicitly said that she's autistic, but I strongly read her that way, and I know a lot of other people do as well. Keiko works at a convenience store, and she has done so for like 18 years. She's in her mid-30s. She's done nothing but this since she was a teenager. And she doesn't want to do anything else. She's found a way to survive, not thrive because she doesn't want to thrive, but just maintain a consistently reliable and routine life within our capitalistic structures. Her family want her to get married. Her colleagues all think it's weird that she hasn't advanced or gone on to bigger and better things, but she's happy how she is. A single woman who works at a convenience store and knows what to expect out of her every day. It makes her feel comfortable, but it also alienates her massively, both professionally and socially. Life is a struggle for her, and a lot of people will not understand her and might even dislike her because of it, but I get her, and she gets me. It's a very weird thing, the fact that half the books I've talked about today have been yellow. Not sure what that's about. But the last book on this list is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. In that video I made where I talked about how protagonists don't have to be likable, I talked about how Ishiguro is above writing likable characters. And that's often the case with more literary fiction. Literary authors are not trying to write likable characters with good morals. They're never trying to write heroes. And Ishiguro is the best example of that. His characters are not heroes. They are flawed and broken people. People with secrets. Unreliable narrators. People with bad morals and ethics. People who are interesting. People who represent certain themes, morals and ideas, certain elements of society. And Stevens is such a wonderful example. This book is set in the 1950s. Stevens is a butler. His father was a butler, and butling is all he's ever known. He has attachments to the old ways of doing things, what is proper, what is good. He sees the class system, the dreadful hierarchy of British society, as natural and good and something to be proud of, something that feels balanced and right. He has a stiff upper lip and a high chin, and he looks down on his own station by looking up at the people that he deems worthy of being in charge of things just because they were born into it. His morals are lackluster. He doesn't think anything through. He just follows routine and follows the way that things are and should be. He is an extreme version of a conservative thinker, and because of that, he's pretty unlikable. But you spend the novel in his head as he takes a road trip to meet the one who got away, the woman he just let go because of his morals, because of his ethics, because of his attitude toward rules and regulations and how things should be. He has ruined his own life, and you feel so sad for him. He doesn't even know he's ruined it, because he struggles so much with objective and subjective truths. He's a fascinating, hollowed out man. There's nothing to really like about him, and yet you'll find him so endearing. My heart breaks for Stevens over and over and over again. I've read this book several times, and I just desperately want to give him a hug. Hopefully I have illustrated here why unlikable characters are so great. And all of these novels have such wonderfully compelling, unlikable protagonists who are all very different from each other. They can be unlikable in subtle ways, they can be likable by some and not others, or they can be truly heinous, horrible, black, gross people. There's a lot of ways to do unlikable characters, and a lot of reasons to do so, as all of these books demonstrate. So enjoy them, support me on Patreon if you'd like to, and subscribe for books.